this is the 43rd anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And I think this is a really, really important event because it's easily, like without question, it's one of the most important events in modern political history because it wasn't just something that changed Iran internally. You know, most people, when they talk about revolutions, they tend to analyze it internally, how the country changed inside. Iran's revolution really affected the entire planet. And that's not an exaggeration, right? So, first of all, let's go through some history. Why was there a revolution? Well, one of the reasons, we can go back to 1908. So oil is discovered in Iran. And of course, you know what comes next. The British, right? So the British came and installed a pipeline in 1909. And this was a company called Burma Oil. Now, Burma Oil created a subsidiary called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and then it changed to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and today it's called BP. You all know BP, British Petroleum. They have gas stations all over the world. It's the same company. And so they built the biggest oil refinery in the world in Iran at a place called Abadan. So they had British workers, they had all these nice amenities and facilities for the British expats to enjoy their lovely little colonial life. And they were screwing the Iranians, like robbing them blind, you know. The Iranians would get 16% of the oil revenue, and the British would calculate how much to give the Iranians in secret. So the Iranians couldn't even see the books. And also, this is after Iran was paying taxes to the British government who owned the oil company. Because Winston Churchill, he was First Lord of the Admiralty back then, so he wasn't Prime Minister yet. And he convinced the British government to buy the company, right? The oil company. And that way he transitioned the Royal Navy from coal to petroleum. You have to keep in mind, at the time, you know, they say Britannia rules the waves. Why? Because Britain had the best navy in the world, right? And the largest empire in the world. And so this is a very significant thing, right? So he convinces the British government to buy this. And look how they're screwing Iran. They're basically taking the oil, making Iran pay taxes to them after they've calculated it in secret. And so come 1953, well, sorry, in 1951, then we'll get to 53. 1951, you have Mossadegh, who is appointed prime minister in Iran by the Mejlis, by the Iranian parliament. So he's democratically elected, right? And he moves to nationalize Iran's oil. And you know what comes next. When you start messing with the paper, when you start messing with the colonizers' paper, it's game over. So in 1953, the CIA and MI6, right, the Central Intelligence Agency and the British MI6, they ousted him. They organized a coup, and they got rid of Mossadegh. Why? Because they wanted to put the Shah back in power, right? The Shah is the king, right? So we're talking about the Pahlavi dynasty. And they put the Shah back in power because he was very friendly to Western interests, right? Guess what he did with the oil? He let them have the oil, right? It went back to the British and the foreign oil companies screwing over Iran and taking the oil. And as I was talking about before, the Shah at one point was, you know, he made Iran the number one customer of weapons from the United States. Think about that. The number one buyer of US weapons was Iran. So they put him back in power in 1953. And, you know, he does everything the West wants him to. He's a puppet. He's a puppet monarch. He establishes ties with Israel, you know, and he gives all the resources over. And this guy is making Iranians suffer. He set up a secret police called the Savak. So the Savak was the secret police in Iran under the Shah. And guess who trained the Savak? The CIA. So the CIA, this is, again, a classic Cold War practice. They're probably still doing it to this day. They would go around training guerrillas, training secret police for foreign governments, repressive governments, and training them in torture. You know, the Savak were extremely, extremely brutal. And they went after everyone. Students, the clergy after at one point. And, you know, again, it's just another instrument that's sponsored, created, and molded by the West. And the CIA did the same thing, of course, in Latin America, training these right-wing guerrillas in torture. It literally be a handbook on this stuff. And so the Savak is very repressive, and this goes on for a very long time, right? So this goes on for over 20 years. And then in 1977, you have uprisings that start in Iran. And these are led by multiple groups. So students played a huge role in the revolution, huge role. The clergy also played a huge role. So the clergy was against these reforms that the Shah was doing, although, as I just mentioned, there were many other reasons to oppose the Shah, not just these reforms. And, what happened is he exiled Imam Khomeini, for example, right? So Iran's leader, the leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, he was exiled for 15 years. And then what happened is the protests became so large. I mean, you have to understand something. Usually, in a revolution, you have 1% of the population that participates in the revolution. That's most cases. Iran was 10% of the population. That's astronomical in terms of, if you compare that to other revolutions. Think about that, right? 10% of the population was revolting. That's huge, huge. And so these protests, they couldn't contain them anymore. And there were massacres. There's a massacre that the Savak, the Shah's secret police, carried out. Again, forgive me, I'm not sure if it was the Savak or the army, but certainly the Shah's forces, without question. The Shah's forces, they carried out a massacre of students. And this really started fueling the uprising. And from the outside, you had Khomeini, who was leading the revolution, right? This isn't really impressive. It was these cassette tapes that they would send in to Iran, and which basically helped fuel the revolution. But again, it's many things at once, right? It's many groups. You had Marxist groups, the student groups, Islamic groups, and 10% of the population came together for this. And then the Shah goes on vacation, right? So he pretended to leave on vacation, and that was game over. Like when he left the country to go on holiday, he was running away. And then Imam Khomeini lands in Tehran. You had over 1 million people in the streets, just to give you an idea how huge this is on that day, right? At his arrival. Over 1 million people in the streets. I mean, the pictures are frankly like, this is a cover of a history book type of pictures. The classic, most important ones of our time. Let me show you this one. I love this one, this picture over here. Because you really need to understand why this is so important and why it molded the world that we're living in today. And so, here, take a look. Look at these crowds, honestly. Just absolutely enormous. I mean, it's not even, you can't even fathom how huge this is, right? Incredible. And so, after Khomeini arrived in Iran, they held a referendum, they formed a new constitution, and so on. And then they founded the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, one thing, I think the only thing, unfortunately, that the Americans, and I don't know about most of the world, but certainly Americans, I think the only thing that they know about the Islamic Revolution is the hostage crisis or the U.S. embassy takeover, right? So what happened is that the Americans gave cover to the Shah, right? He's their puppet, as we were talking about. And the Iranian students who stormed the U.S. embassy wanted the Americans to hand over the Shah. They wanted him to be extradited so they could hold him accountable, so they could try him for all his crimes, the Savak and much more. So the Americans, of course, refused, right? And the Shah, he was going in for cancer treatment. He died of cancer shortly after, right? But the U.S. wouldn't hand him over. If I recall correctly, he was in the U.S. and Egypt after leaving Iran, after running away. And the Iranians had a simple demand. They wanted the Shah to be extradited so they could try him. And, of course, the U.S. never did that. They never complied with it. And then I think after 444 days, it was, all the hostages were released. Another interesting fact, which you might not know, especially if you've watched movies like Argo, which talk about this, the Iranians actually released the black and female hostages in solidarity with oppressed and minorities. So that's something interesting that I didn't even know about until last year. And that's another thing they won't tell you, of course, right? Because they have to smear the Islamic Revolution. They lost their puppet. The Americans and the British lost their puppet. So, of course, they're mad. And like we were saying, they wanted Iran to become the regional policeman, right? What Saudi Arabia is today. So number one customer of arms, give us the oil, and so on and so on. And this failed. And this is a true uprising of the people. Again, go look at most revolutions. It's nowhere near 10%. It's not even close. And so that's really a formidable, it's really crazy. And I want to say another thing, going back to how this influenced the world we live in today, why it's so consequential for the whole world, for the Middle East. Because Iran's revolution, it's based on core values. For example, helping the oppressed, standing with the oppressed. Because the Iranians are living through that themselves. They're living under the Shah, right? They're living under this colonial puppet who's selling out their resources, brutalizing them with the secret CIA-trained police. And so they understand oppression. And it's about rising up and vanquishing the oppressor. But other things that the Iranians did after the revolution, for example, the Israeli embassy, they gave it to the Palestinians, they gave it to the PLO, the building. They confiscated it and gave it to the PLO. I was talking to John White the other day, who's a brilliant writer from Scotland, and he told me something that I didn't know, actually, is that they renamed a street to Bobby Sands. So the street where the British embassy was in Tehran, they renamed it to Bobby Sands Street. And then, so basically here, let me show you. Churchill Avenue, adjoining the British Embassy in Tehran, was changed to Bobby Sands Avenue to commemorate a Northern Irish politician and member of the Provisional IRA who died of a hunger strike in 1981 while incarcerated. Right? So this embarrassed the British because they then had to change the embassy address. Right? So this is the kind of jabs against colonialism that the Iranians did. And it's much more than that, because in 1982, what happens? The Israelis invade Lebanon again, right? And then you have Hezbollah, which is formed. Now, again, if you only listen to Western media, if you're only watching garbage CNN and BBC, and even if, unfortunately, if you only listen to Western academics, they'll tell you that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. No, it's only a terrorist organization if you're, an Israeli who's occupying Lebanon. Hezbollah was formed as a result of Israel invading Lebanon, specifically South Lebanon. This is UNIFIL, is the UN mission there. Both my parents served in UNIFIL, in this South Lebanon mission. And so who helped to create Hezbollah? Iran. Right? Now, of course, unfortunately, in the West, they have to dumb things down and make it into propaganda. So what they'll tell you is that Hezbollah is a Shia militia, and that's the only reason that Iran supports it, because it's like a religious issue. They always want to create sectarian divides. That's complete bullshit. If you go to Lebanon, you have literally tons of Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims who all support Hezbollah. It's not a religious issue. And not even just in Lebanon. You will find lots of people who support Hezbollah in Syria. It's literally the complete opposite. Nothing to do with religion. Why do you think Hezbollah was in Syria fighting ISIS and protecting Christians? Make it make sense. So they never have answers for these things. But anyway, going back to what we were saying. So Iran helped to create Hezbollah to vanquish the Israelis who had invaded and occupied South Lebanon. And that's what happened. That's what happened. In the end, Hezbollah, not the Lebanese army, Hezbollah drove out the Israelis in the year 2000, and humiliated them. And then in 2006, Israel attacked Lebanon again, and I was just next door in Syria, right? So Damascus is 2 hours away from Lebanon, and there was a war for 33 days in summer of 2006. And again, it was very scary because, every single day, that's the only thing on TV, and there was a worry that Syria would be drawn in the war. But what happened is Hezbollah humiliated the Israelis because they weren't ready. By this time, Hezbollah had lots of advanced weaponry, which was given to them by Iran, right? They totaled an Israeli ship. Like, think of that for a second. Like, the Israelis are thinking Hezbollah, they're just ground troops. And then all of a sudden, a ship is almost taken down. So it really upped the ante. It was a complete wake-up call and shock for the Israelis. And that's, again, thanks to Iran helping them out. And just to put that into perspective for you, Israel has never bombed Lebanon again since 2006. So that's... just to be fair, they did carry out a strike just on the border, I think, a year ago. But, I mean, they never bombed Beirut again and attacked the same way they did before. Because they're scared, and they're no match for Hezbollah. It's a fact, and they hate it. And so the thing is that this is thanks to Iran giving Hezbollah training and weapons and support for this popular resistance. And then if you look at Hamas, again, let me show you again how this Western talking is bullshit, because they'll tell you that Iran supports Shia militias. Hamas is Sunni. Hamas is not Shia. Why does Iran support them then? Because they're a resistance movement. So again, this completely debunks their bullshit that, like people in the Middle East are so stupid and they have a religious issue. They're Sunnis versus Shias. That's nonsense. That's complete bullshit. And this is another thing that shows you that it's bullshit. So, to this day, Iran is supporting Hamas against the Israeli occupation, because Iran is supporting the oppressed. It's supporting the oppressed in Palestine. It's supporting the oppressed in Lebanon. And the same thing in Syria. When Syria was attacked by these, these waves of jihadists, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, basically, Daesh, Faylaq al-Rahman, Jaish al-Islam, all of these various brigades that were funded by Turkey, by Qatar, by Saudi Arabia, by the US, by the UK, who came to save Syria? Damascus was about to fall to ISIS. The capital was about to fall to ISIS. And if it weren't for Russia, if it weren't for Iran, who the hell knows what would have happened to Syria? And again, this is very hard to digest for some people, because their whole lives they've grown up swallowing bullshit that, Iran is a terrible country, Russia is a terrible country, they're all dictatorships and they're repressive. They can't fucking grasp that the world is not what CNN told you it's like. And it's not based on sectarian issues. And it is possible that countries are helping each other because they're anti-colonial, because they're anti-imperialist, and they believe in a common cause. And this is the thing why I'm saying Iran's revolution is so important, because it's influenced and shaped the entire Middle East, right? If it weren't for Iran, maybe South Lebanon would still be under Israeli occupation, Maybe they would have taken even more land. If it weren't for Iran, maybe Daesh, maybe ISIS would have taken over Syria. If it weren't for Iran supporting Hamas, maybe, who knows what would have happened to Gaza or to Palestine. So these are just a few examples. I can also tell you about outside the Middle East. I can tell you also about, Venezuela, for example. Who is sending Venezuela oil? No one wants to deal with Venezuela now, because the United States have vilified them and marginalized them with sanctions, right? So if you're a trader or you have some kind of financial business, with Venezuela, whatever it is, whether you're engaged in commercial activity or financial activity, you can't touch Venezuela anymore, because Venezuela is a hot potato. If the Americans find out that you're doing business with Venezuela, they will fine you. They will kick you out of the United States. They'll shut down your company because you're in violation of U.S. sanctions. Again, U.S. sanctions are just legal in the U.S. They're not approved by the UN. They're not legal under international law. They're actually illegal because they're unilateral punitive measures. But in any case, my point is that they've ostracized Venezuela, so no one wants to deal with Venezuela except Iran. Iran is one of the few countries that's actually sticking its neck out and sending Venezuela fuel in exchange for gold. And what did the British do when they found this out? They stole Venezuela's gold in the Bank of England. So they have over $1 billion worth of Venezuelan gold in London in the Bank of England that's been confiscated because they want to stop Venezuela from trading with Iran. Because again, Venezuela has oil. Venezuela is sitting on the largest supply of crude in the world, but it can't refine it because the infrastructure has been decimated by sanctions. So in order to get fuel, they have to go to the other side of the planet and get it from Iran. And again, it's so disgusting because Iran and Venezuela are two sovereign countries. They're not obliged to accept U.S. sanctions. They're free to trade with each other. They are free countries, sovereign countries. But the US and the UK can't tolerate that, so they have to go and steal the gold, steal the oil, sell it off. It's piracy. It's literally piracy. And so this is another area where Iran is helping another country. Is Venezuela Shia? Answer that question. Is Venezuela a Shia country? It's nothing to do with that. Again, it's nothing to do with religion. It's to do with helping others who are oppressed, forging alliances based on a common interest, based on opposing imperialism. And they can't grasp this in the Western media. Maybe they grasp it, but they don't want to tell you, because then if you start telling people, well, this is an anti-imperialist movement, the alliance is based on opposing U.S. sanctions, then you have to explain what is going on. You have to explain the oppression and divulge who is doing the oppression. You divulge the identity of the oppressor, which is the United States, and that creates a problem because it breaks the narrative, right? So the Iranian Revolution, it toppled this US, UK-backed monarch. It took back the national resources of Iran, and it started becoming a country that helps others who are oppressed, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Venezuela. And that's really important to understand, because when you just listen to the history books, the curated history books in the West, they don't explain this to you. It's not even just in the West, by the way. Even if you go, unfortunately, the Saudi government, I can't speak so much for the Saudi people. I'm assuming that, when we talk about governments like Saudi Arabia or the United States, I'm talking about the governments. I'm not talking about everyone in that country. That's, you're not, your government's crimes do not represent you necessarily. But the narrative in Saudi Arabia, the narrative in the United States and Europe is that these are terrorist organizations. They're not terrorist organizations. They oppose colonialism. It's very interesting when you hear them talk about Palestine, for example, because they say that, these Hamas terrorists, they're trying to kill us, these Hezbollah terrorists. Dude, Hezbollah and Hamas did not even exist until the 1980s. What was happening in those 40 years before that? Were you not stealing the land of Palestinians? Were you not fighting, to take Syria's Golan Heights? Are you not still occupying Syria's Golan Heights? Are you not still occupying Shab'a farms in Lebanon? There was no Hamas. There was no Hezbollah. These things didn't exist. So that again makes their whole narrative fall apart. It's nothing to do with terrorism. It's bullshit. They just call them terrorism because they want to cut off their funding and their support. And to make sure that Hezbollah can't function, they go and pressure Germany, for example, to declare it a terrorist organization. And then they go and pressure the UK government to declare Hamas a terrorist organization. So you stop these these organizations, these resistance groups from being able to access funding and other resources, right? That's what it is. It's oppression. You got an oppressor, colonizers, imperialists trying to squash and snuff out any sort of resistance. So, of course, if you're an Israeli colonizer, if you're, a European colonial power, if you're the Americans, yeah, I guess in your point of view, given what your agenda is, then, yeah, maybe Hamas is a terrorist group for you. And the same of Hezbollah and so on. And so when Mike Pompeo comes on and says Iran is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, I mean, you have to laugh out loud. Like, you are the CIA director. You literally created Al-Qaeda. You're helping Al-Qaeda in Syria. You created them in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And you're talking about state sponsors of terrorism? Look in the fucking mirror, pal. Christ almighty. Like, the projection is unreal. It's unreal. And so that's what happens when you're fighting on behalf of the oppressed. The oppressor will come and start saying that, you're a terrorist and so on and so on. And these are just a few examples of what I was talking about. And I want to say something that it does have a little bit of a religious context, because the Iranians also, they look back to Imam Hussein, who was killed, who's murdered, in the 7th century in Iraq. And so that's also where this idea of being on the side of the oppressed is important, and helping the oppressed is important. It's important to stand against oppression. That's it. Also has a religious context, right? We cannot forget that because it's very important, and it's also at the same time It's just look at Iran's history, being controlled by the British, by the Americans, the resources stolen. So they know what it's like. And just to give you another idea of this wave of coups, just the year after, in 1954, the U.S. Went after Guatemala because United Fruit was in trouble. Again, you have a country nationalizing its own resources. In this case, the banana fields, right? All the crops, all the produce. And that puts a dent in United Fruit, right? United Fruit is this U.S. corporation, which is now known as Chiquita. You know Chiquita bananas. That's the same company. They just rebranded. It's the same thing with BP, right? So these companies are literally getting their governments to start coups, to fucking overthrow foreign governments so they can keep their profits up. It's no different from when you have Raytheon, entering the government and starting wars to drive up profits. So this is an old template that they've been using over and over, in Iran, in Guatemala, all over the place. And that's really, really important to put that into context. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you, wanted to go through why Iran's revolution is such a consequential political event, not just domestically, but really, truly internationally. And, it changed the entire makeup of the Middle East. And look, even today, Iran is at the center of these international affairs because of the nuclear deal, for example. For a country that's under so many sanctions, for a country that's under such an embargo, it's honestly impressive. Like, it doesn't, again, I don't want to make you think like that BBC Hard Talk host is like, you said that sanctions are bad and that you are suffering, yet you are circumventing them. Yeah. So both can be true at the same time. Iran is under sanctions, but it's also, and it's circumventing them, but that doesn't mean the sanctions are not brutal. Of course they're fucking brutal. So that doesn't change anything. But I'm just saying that Iran, for example, its military capabilities, they've just unveiled a new ballistic missile. And then they had two others in August 2020. I think they named them after Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and General Qasem. They named these new ballistic and cruise missiles after them. They have a very potent, very capable military and defense capability, despite being under sanctions. Look at, for example, the nuclear program. Again, it's not a weapons program. It's a civilian nuclear program. I feel like this is so rudimentary and so basic, but I have to repeat it because if you watch the mainstream media, they make you think Iran has a nuclear weapons program. Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. It has a civilian nuclear program. Obviously, to make a weapon, you need a program in the first place, but that doesn't mean you are necessarily building a bomb. There are many European countries who have nuclear energy. That doesn't mean they have nuclear weapons. So it's I have to repeat this because in the mainstream media, they drill you and condition you with this fucking bullshit. Iran is not pursuing a bomb. But my point was that it has a very capable nuclear program. And that's, again, despite the sanctions. And you have to consider one thing also. Iran is really hurting because of the sanctions. And it still helps the Yemenis. It still helps the Venezuelans. It still helps the Syrians, the Palestinians, the Lebanese. That takes a lot. There are countries who have enough resources, who are not in war, who are not under sanctions, and they wouldn't do anywhere near as much for Syria or Venezuela or Palestine or Yemen. So I think that's very important to underscore that. You know what it reminds me of? I saw a few months ago in I think it was in Yemen. So this is last year, I think in May, during the bombings in Gaza. You had people in Yemen who are starving from a Saudi embargo, who are being killed every day by Saudi Arabia with US bombs and British bombs. They put together money to send to Palestinians. Like that. Like, what do you say about such levels of integrity and empathy and sympathy and humanity? It's truly admirable. You got people who are fucking starving, who are in war, and they collect money to send it to others. So I think that's really admirable, honestly. And, the Palestinians do the same too. Everyone's helping each other out. And I think that's very admirable. And it's so important to highlight this because it's beyond sectarian bullshit that they tell you in the media. It's beyond the propaganda. You have to understand the movement, the resistance axis, why it's so important. That's it, man. And you look at the Middle East today, Iran is at the center of the resistance axis. You know, again, the Middle East would be, who knows what it would look like if Syria was overrun by these US-backed terrorists, by ISIS, by Al-Qaeda. Who knows what Palestine would look like? Who knows what Lebanon would look like? You need to have a counterweight in the region. If Iran is not going to help these countries, who's going to help them? Who's going to stand with them? We'd be done for. We'd be done for. And I'm going to tell you something, man. These Americans like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio who pretend to care about Christians in Syria and Iraq, I will tell you as a Syrian Christian, Iran cares about Christians. Iran cares about minorities. Iran is the one that sent people to fight your fucking CIA terrorists and save minorities and everyone in general from your terrorists. That, you know, it really makes me angry what they say, all this nonsense. And you look at Saudi Arabia, look at the Emirates. These people stabbed the Palestinians in the back. They said, screw you, and they went and normalized ties with Israel. Iran is not even an Arab country. Iran is not even an Arab country, and it does more than some Arab countries to help the Palestinians. That is shameful. Shame on Saudi Arabia, shame on the Emirates. Not the people, the governments, shame on them. What does that say when Iran, who is not an Arab country, is doing more than you? Where are the Arabs who should all be standing behind the Palestinians? This is shameful for these governments who do this. Disgusting. If Iran wasn't helping the resistance, who would be helping them? Where are you? Where are you? You're not helping the Palestinians. You're screwing them and, dealing with the Israelis under the table. Disgusting. And now you understand one of the reasons why Syria is attacked, Iran is attacked, because they stand with the Palestinians. No compromise. I'm not saying Syria has never done, I'm not saying Syria always did everything right with the Palestinians. It's not true. But there is a consistent position for the most part. And that's one of the reasons, because these countries resist imperialism. That's why they try to break them and cripple them and stop them from resisting. That's so important to understand. And that doesn't mean they're perfect. No one is saying Iran is perfect. No one said Syria is perfect. But don't get it twisted when it comes to the motivations. Don't get it twisted to, in regards to what is going on. Okay? And honestly, that is, I really, it makes me so angry when these U.S. Politicians, pretend that they care about minorities. Bullshit. Trump went and assassinated General Soleimani, and then Mike Pompeo, he has the stones to say that Soleimani was killing thousands of Christians across the Middle East. You made that up. It's literally the opposite. You, ex-director of the CIA, is helping ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Israel is helping ISIS and Al-Qaeda openly. General Soleimani was fighting for Christians. Iran, Russia were fighting for Christians. Hezbollah was fighting for Christians. And not just them, everyone. Every sane, civilized person who opposes Daesh, who opposes Al-Qaeda, who opposes this Western-backed, this Saudi-backed terrorism. So in any case, I just wanted to go through again on the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, some important history, what the relationship is, what the motivations are, why the Middle East, the makeup of the Middle East, the political, geopolitical makeup of the Middle East looks the way that it does today, and how Iran is crucial in supporting resistance movements worldwide, even in Latin America, not just in the Middle East. It's very important to understand.